Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Sasha Issenberg. Sasha is a journalist, author, and teacher. He has written for the Boston Globe, Slave, Bloomberg Politics, and Business News. He also teaches political science at University of California, Los Angeles, and he has written 4 books. His latest is The Engagement, America's quarter-century struggle over same-sex marriage. Sasha, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Alan. I'm glad to be here.
So, Sasha, your book, I find it to be not only a narrative about same-sex marriage, but also a lesson on how democracy works and how our moral compass is flexible and changes over time. The things that we like gay marriage, we will see, oh, that I'm totally against that. Now with time is something that is non-consequential. So, and you show us the transition on how that mentality, that moral compass, starts changing over time, maybe a little bit at a time, and then all of a sudden. I wonder if we could start by you telling us a little bit about yourself, about your professional career, your life as a writer and journalist and teacher.
Sure. So I've been a newspaper reporter, a magazine writer, and editor. I published my first book in 2007 about the global sushi business called The Sushi Economy. And that grew out of a magazine story that I had written. And then my second book also grew out of a magazine story that I had written. And part of what is appealing to me about writing books is the ability to sort of throw myself into a new world and spend a bit of time, going deep into a given subject and trying to unpack a sort of complex topic. And so, my first 2 books were about these worlds, and in certain respects I had defined, like the global sushi business was sort of what I wanted it to be. So, for example, in a really superficial way, like my book was a lot about the tuna trade and not so much about the salmon trade, because, I set the rules. My second book, called The Victory Lab, was about the science of political campaigns, and I sort of got to pick and choose which innovations I thought sort of belonged in that story and which ones didn't. The thing about this latest book that you mentioned, The Engagement, is that the subject matter exists sort of apart from me, right? So I came to this and I said, the United States had been through this massive change on this particular issue, on attitudes towards gay marriage, and I wanted to understand how that had happened. And so it's sort of the first time that I've written a book that has a kind of like externally defined topic that I set out to try to write a sort of comprehensive account of the whole thing.
Is that how it starts for you? I mean, you are a journalist, you are constantly looking for things to write about. So you mentioned that in your previous book, you wrote an essay and then you extended it into a book. So is that how you search for topics to write about?
Well, that's how it happened with the first 2. I set out on both of these things to write a magazine article. And, I set the ambition of that magazine article for the length of a magazine story. And so, where I have a few months to work on it, and, at 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 words. But, part of when I pitch a story to an editor, I am thinking about the scope of the story matching the sort of space and time and resources that I have available to research and write it. This one came about a little differently. And so, and then in each of those cases, I wrote a magazine story. And what happened was there's sort of a few steps on that. One, over the course of my research, I realized that there are a lot of things that basically I go to the library and there are a lot of things that I want to read to explain to me the background. And I realized that nobody has written this thing that I sort of assume should have been documented somewhere. In the case of the sushi book, I realized that none of this had been written in English. A lot of it actually hadn't been written in Japanese, and so that sort of gives me, I think, the initial germ of an idea that there's a space here for a book length treatment. And then the real test for me is, by the time I'm done with working on the magazine article, am I still like curious about this subject, or I'm a generalist, and so often I'm very happy when I'm done with a story to just be done with it and move on to the next thing I can write about. And so if I'm still curious about a topic And I feel like I've just begun to sort of pull out what interests me about it. That's a pretty good indication, not only that there might be a book in there, but that there's a book that I actually want to spend the years working on. And this book came about very differently. I'd never written basically a word about gay marriage. I'd been a political reporter during much of the time that this had been, I think sort of the dominant cultural, social conflict in the United States, but I'd never written about it. And it just sort of struck me in 2011 that we were already starting to talk about this as sort of the defining civil rights movement of my generation. And I had no idea where this issue would come from, how the arc of the issue, how it had come to sort of dominate our politics, and how at the time it began to be clear to me that we were at least approaching some version of consensus on it. And so this just seemed like a big, obvious topic that I did want to read a book about it. And I was sort of surprised that nobody had tried to approach it that way.
And okay, I think I heard in one of the interviews that you did in another podcast that you yourself, you are not gay. So considering that there are so many social issues to write about, what was the particular attachment to this one in particular?
So the first thing that sort of drove my curiosity about it was, so I spent 2011 writing that book, The Victory Lab. And so I was interviewing over the course of that year a lot of pollsters or people who dealt with public opinion who told me they'd never seen attitudes change as quickly on a single issue as they had on gay marriage in the United States. And I'd written enough about political campaigns to know how difficult persuasion is and how surprising that this was the type of issue, because it has, the sort of foundation of religious and traditional values in it, that you'd see this kind of, significant shift across the population. So that was the first thing that interests me. And then the other part of it was that, I sort of came to agree with this idea that it was the most significant civil rights breakthrough of I'm 41 now. I was 31 in 2011. And so probably the defining part of my identity, yes, I'm a straight man. I'm now married to a woman whom I met about midway working on this book. The part of my identity that probably draws me to this is not my sexual orientation, but my being, my generation, where this, my sort of political coming of age was in a period where basically the Cold War was over. We'd reached sort of a broad set of consensus in the 1990s on like the big questions about political economy, about the role of government in the economy, stuff like that. Prior to September 11th, there was a sort of void in our politics, and we as a country focused on a lot of social cultural issues, especially around sexual politics, that gained a sort of primacy in our political debates that hadn't been there before. And I think, to some degree, this is me as somebody born in 1980 trying to reckon with how this became, throughout my 20s, the big sort of point of cultural and social friction in my country.
Wow. Okay, I will share a little bit of info. I come from Colombia, and it's a macho society. And I myself, as a young man, I used to be homophobic. I even remember getting into some fights or whatever. And I live now in Montreal, which is one of the most, I don't know, liberal cities in North America. And I was yesterday in the gay parade marching with it. So there's been there's been a transformation in my mind that this close mentality, that this is how nature tells us things ought to be, to total openness to people's preferences, sexual preferences. So anyway, that has been the transformation in my own life. I wonder if you could summarize, I mean, this is the whole topic of your book, the whole transformation or the history of the United States being totally against homosexuality in general to today, where same-sex marriage is legal.
Yeah, so it wasn't until 2003 that the United States Supreme Court ruled that states could not ban private consensual gay sex. So In the United Kingdom, that happened in the early 1970s. Even in Ireland, that happened in the early 1980s. And so the United States was very late among its sort of cultural peer countries in just decriminalizing homosexuality. And in 1986, the Supreme Court upheld the right of states uh, uh, to express moral disapproval of homosexuality through its laws. And so that was sort of the foundation on which our entire gay sort of politics around gay rights was set through the 1980s and into the 1990s. And so what you get is after the Stonewall moment in New York in the early 1970s, you get this blossoming of what people call gay liberation. You get a gays and lesbians who start to assert themselves, assert their personal identity as a sort of young political movement. And there's a real tension in that between, are we as gays and lesbians trying to just be free of government interference in our private lives? Is this just about our sexual privacy? Our only goal is to stop basically being criminalized for who we are? Or are we trying to engage in a sort of broader restructuring of American laws and attitudes around sex? And so that's a sort of, and so the gay rights movement begins to become professionalized and well-funded and organized in the late 1970s. And people are fighting for very basic legal protections at that point, the ability not to be fired for being gay or lesbian. In the same way that starting in the 1960s, the federal government made clear that you cannot be fired for your race, you cannot be denied housing because of your sex or your religion, for example. And so the basic goal was include sexual orientation in those categories. And that's sort of the, and then the big thing that happens in the 1980s is the emergence of HIV/AIDS, which in many respects sort of distracts and diverts the political energy that had been built around trying to get these non-discrimination, equal protection laws and decriminalizing sodomy laws. Now, all of a sudden, gay men in particular are focused urgently on this public health issue and, winning funding, basically just getting government to take this seriously. And my book starts in 1990 when these local events in Hawaii basically thrust this totally new question that hadn't been part of that debate over the previous 20 years onto the scene. And that is, should two men or two women be allowed to legally marry? And nobody had seriously engaged with that question. There've been a few sort of lone lawsuits in the 1970s, none of them sort of backed by civil rights organizations or have real legal strategy. There've been sort of abstract debates that had played out among lawyers and legal theorists in the 1980s about this, but there's barely a politician in the United States who'd ever been asked his or her opinion on gay marriage. It just wasn't an issue. And so, the beginning of my story is how this emerges basically out of nowhere and then ends up becoming the gay rights issue on which, the conflict over sort of the possibilities and limits of full citizenship for gays and lesbians becomes fought.
Yeah, you mentioned in your book that actually it was not a priority among the gay activists. To be able to get married, they have other priorities at that moment. I wonder what was the pushback of the religious institutions at that time.
So the first major sort of religious institution to basically fight gay marriage rights starting in around 1994 is the Mormon Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And they, the opposition, the Mormon Church had a sort of theological opposition to homosexuality for a few decades at that point. A lot of the anti-gay political activity had been driven by evangelical Protestants and Catholics. And so, the Mormons, in part because they are, in certain respects, more savvy about politics in the United States, I think, than sort of either of those other two denominations end up being the drivers of the response to a court decision in Hawaii in 1993. And what that does is, through the 1980s, there's plenty of anti-gay activism from mostly driven by religious conservatives, sort of arguing that any expansion of gay rights is antithetical to biblical teaching. But the areas in which they're trying to stop the expansion of gay rights is, making sure that the gays and lesbians are not written into sexual orientation is not written into civil rights laws, that hate crimes laws do not specifically treat sexual orientation as a protected category, that, in the late 1970s, the 1978 voters in California, where I live now, voted on a proposal to ban gays and lesbians from being public school teachers, keeping gays and lesbians out of the military. I mean, these were sort of the areas. They were not trying to stop gays and lesbians from marrying until the mid-1990s, because it was sort of beyond the imagination of even the most fervent anti-gay religious conservatives that gays and lesbians would seriously try to redraw the marriage laws to include them. I mean, so much of this LN is about like sort of a test of the imagination, because it's just so far beyond our sort of set of political issues in the 1990s that a lot of the early parts of this book are people just sort of saying like, is this real? And how do we organize a politics around an issue that kind of comes out of nowhere?
Right. Well, part of the book focus on how quickly the perception and the political machinery changed from being being against gay marriage to now being something of non-consequence. And from the outsider's point of view, America is considered this beacon of liberty, freedoms, this and that. At the same time, gay marriage had been legal in Canada 10 years before, 2005. And in many other countries, Netherlands, for example, Spain, I forget which other ones. So from another point of view, I ask myself, what took so long? It's, of course, it happens in 25 years. It's a complete change and very fast. At the same time, I feel like America is a little bit late to the party as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of this is just the unique nature of the American governmental system, in that marriage has been one sort of a very highly decentralized policy question. And so states have, for the entirety of American history, had incredible leeway to set their own laws about who can marry and what the processes are. And only in exceptional circumstances has the federal government stepped in and said to states that there are boundaries as to what you can do with marriage. So, during the late 19th century, there was a sort of crisis over polygamy in the Western states, and Congress said, we are not going to grant statehood to any state that allows multiple marriages. The Supreme Court in the 1960s struck down state bans on interracial marriage. There was an effort early in the 20th century to standardize divorce laws through Congress. But by and large, basically in our system, states get to do whatever they want on marriage, and the burden is on the federal government to come in and say that what you're doing violates some broader principle. And that's not the way, certainly, that Western Europe approaches marriage laws. And so in the United States, one way to look at this is it took till 2015 for the Supreme Court to get involved and to standardize this and prevent states from banning gays and lesbians from marrying. But another way to look at it is that the first state in the United States to allow gay marriage in 2004 was out of a court decision that was just a few months after the first court decision in Ontario in Canada. And one difference of the Canadian system is that the courts, the Supreme Court can give advisory opinions in Canada. And so there was what happened after, I'm no expert on Canadian law, but after Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia had rule to legalize same-sex marriage through their provincial courts, basically there was the opportunity for I believe it's Paul Martin's government to come in and say, we're going to push for legislation to standardize this. And that's was not going to be the way that this ever came to the United States. And so, so many of the Western European countries ended up legalizing same-sex marriage by a law of the legislature. One, a law that says in the Netherlands or France or Portugal, that gays and lesbians can now marry, and that was never really a viable policy option, just given the way we deal with marriage laws in the United States.
Okay, so being many Western countries now, same-sex marriage is legal, it's not even an issue. But I just took a look at Wikipedia, my number one resource, and yes. I saw that 33 countries have in their constitution that it's illegal to have same-sex marriage. I assume that within time and people evolve, it will become legal all around the world. Maybe it will take, I don't know, 100 years or so, but I believe that's the way we're going. Do you share the same opinion?
I think probably that policies will converge on this. I mean, in a small way, something that has happened around other gay rights issues in the U.S., marriage included, that we see, given that we have 50 states in the United States, there's some way in which this is a useful way of understanding how different states learn from each other and adjust their policies to match other ones. And one of the things that was a driver in many states in the US liberalizing their laws on all sorts of LGBT issues has been the business community. And so that, it ends up being a competition question where corporations are not necessarily like liberal about social justice issues by their, purpose. But what we saw in the United States, there, just in the last 5 or 6 years, there were anti-gay laws that emerged in Indiana and in Arkansas, and the biggest organizations lobbying to beat those anti-gay laws were Eli Lilly in Indianapolis at the state capitol and Walmart in Little Rock at the state capitol. And neither of those, pharmaceuticals and Walmart, are not America's like great liberal left-wing industries, but they saw it as a, that for them as employers, that they need to draw talent to leave, New York or San Francisco or LA or wherever to come work in Indianapolis or in Bentonville, Arkansas. And that it becomes very difficult to be internationally competitive when the people you're trying to hire see local laws as in conflict with their identity, their material interests. One of the things that's, I spoke recently with a group of folks in Singapore who, Singapore is one of the 60 or so countries where the impediment is not, in my understanding, a constitutional provision, as you note, but the fact that basically 19th century British laws criminalizing gay sex remain on the book. So
wow.
In a lot of Africa, this is an issue, in some of South Asia. Basically, throughout the British Empire, the United Kingdom amended their laws in the 1960s, but all these countries that never went through their own legal process, and so they have laws on the books that continue to make gay sex illegal. And what you see in Singapore, obviously, which wants to think of its economic peer countries as, Western Europe, North American countries, East Asia. It's the business community that's becoming a big driver of just fundamental gay rights issues, because they think, Taiwan legalized same-sex marriage in the last couple of years, for example. Australia, New Zealand have, and if Singapore is trying to go out and get companies to make their Asian headquarters in Singapore instead of in Sydney or Taipei or Tokyo or Hong Kong or wherever, or New York or London, they, very few global companies are going to want to be in a place where they think that their ability to assemble a talented, diverse workforce is impeded by local laws. And so my guess is we'll start to see, over that 100-year arc or whatever, that one of the drivers of this change is advocacy and lobbying from corporations, some of whom will actually try to lobby governments and courts to change the laws, and some of whom will just sort of set on the demand side, saying we're just not going to open up a regional office in a country whose laws we think are at odds with our workforce, and hope that local leadership sort of responds to those economic incentives.
Right. Okay. Last question. Well, there are many issues that are important to Americans. I wonder if some activists, let's say for legalization of drugs, could take this framework, which is the legalization of same-sex marriage, and apply it to their pet projects. Other issues that I can think of is universal education or universal healthcare. I wonder what is it that they could maybe replicate and use for their own activism.
Yeah, and it's a great question, and it's something that here in the United States we see so many activists look at, especially on the left, but not exclusively, look at the success and speed of the gay marriage movement as a model that they want to learn from. One thing that we know contributed to this rapid shift in attitudes was people getting to know gays and lesbians. Social scientists call this contact theory. It's, in a more foundational way, it is something we all sort of know from our own lives, but polling data reflects it, that the thing, the factor that is most likely to drive somebody to more liberal attitudes on these questions is if they say that they tell a pollster that they know they have a friend, coworker, or family member who's openly gay or lesbian, and that's obviously different. The nature of sexual orientation, where we assume that people are born with this sort of hardwired to them, is different, but that they control the terms under which they disclose it or announce it to other people. It's very different than race or religion or sex, where often people cannot hide it. It's essential to who they are. And then one of the obvious things is that gays and lesbians are being born into every household, every neighborhood in the country. And so there's a kind of natural liberalizing effect, because it is very unlikely that a Jewish child is going to be born to Catholic parents, or that an immigrant child is going to be born to native born parents, or a Black child will be born to white parents. But gay children are born to straight parents all the time. You find out you have a gay neighbor, you find out that somebody in your office is gay. And so I think the question for other movements is there a way to, and one thing, this happens organically as a result of that, but also campaigns became better at using the context of a political campaign, either a legislative campaign or a referendum, to have voters, strangers, meet somebody who was openly gay or lesbian, have a conversation with them about it. And that there's evidence that movement. Could you do this in other areas where you have people who don't think that they know a recreational drug user meet somebody in the context of a campaign or advertising, and this is James, he smokes marijuana, he's a normal, good person? Would that change their view of this? Could you, if you're trying to change gun laws, as there's an effort to in the United States, could you try to use campaigns to introduce people to people who are victims of gun violence? There are probably limits to this, but clearly I think for things that are around identity-based movements, that finding a way to expose people who've never gotten to know someone different than them, I think we have reason to believe will be a huge driver of change in political attitudes. And the question is how you can sort of manufacture that if you don't have biology sort of doing the work for you the way you do with sexual orientation.
Well, Sasha, the last question is, can you tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow you?
So it's called The Engagement, America's Quarter Century Struggle Over Same-Sex Marriage. It's on you know,
everywhere.
the books you listen to, the ones you read on the screen, paper. And they can follow me. I have a website, sashaisenberg.com. So that's my first name, last name.com. And that has links to my Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And I'm even on TikTok because my niece started telling me that I needed to be on Book Talk. So
Wow.
yeah, sashaisenberg.com.
Well, Sasha, thank you so much for your time.
I really enjoy this chat. Thanks, Ellen.